Some people like to make the argument against the free software movement that copyleft software and also the requirement for software to be free libre would be restricting people's freedoms because they now cannot use the license of their choosing when distributing software. So I will include both the copyleft and the requirement for software to be free libre, whether that's, for example, in a law that requires that all software must be free libre, together, because they both have the same argument opposing them. So the essence of the argument that opposes the position of the free software movement is the same. So that's why I'm clumping them together for this speech. So, of course, the GPL is a copyleft license, and all the software you redistribute must be GPL if it includes any GPL software. And then the law, a hypothetical law, that would require that all software be free libre. It would just require that all software be free libre. So in this case there is no specific license, because there wouldn't really be licenses necessarily. There would just be software, and all the software would need to be free libre software. So by law they would all give the people the rights to use them and distribute them and all that stuff. So the argument against the position of the free software movement is being made that it violates a person's freedom, since they now cannot use the license of their choosing when distributing the software they make. However, the argument that the free software movement makes, that those people do not understand or agree with, is that it is not freedom that is taken from the people when they cannot choose any arbitrary license that they want. And I will explain why that is. When you make a software, and under the current laws of copyright, you are entitled to the legal rights that the copyright law grants you. With those laws, you have the power to exercise control over other people's use of that work, and in this case it's software. So what you have is the legal mechanism to set rules on how other people can use that software. Now, whether you agree that you are entitled to such rights, that you deserve such rights fundamentally, that it's a question of moral right and wrong and you deserve those sorts of rights, that is irrelevant for now. But so long as everyone understands the technicalities of what it is that people support and what is it that they oppose, then whatever ethical positions you may take, we can discuss those later. But for now, let's look at the technicalities. The copyright law, it grants the people who make the works the rights in law, so legal rights, to exercise control over other people. That takes the form of a license. The person who makes the work is now the copyright holder for that work. But even if there was no specific legal mechanism for giving the people arbitrary powers in the law, even just not distributing the source code when distributing software would still make that software proprietary, because the definition of free libre software not only includes the rights to use and distribute the software, but also to get the source code. So the source code must be distributed along with the software as well, so it's not enough to just get rid of copyright law. So that's also something important to keep in mind. So the way that works is because even if the person who distributes the software, when not giving the source code, does not necessarily write rules on how to use software in case copyright law is removed and they don't get any legal rights to set any license terms, that person is still kind of obstructing the use of that software because, well, they are at the very least in spirit violating the idea of the freedom of the user, because if the user doesn't have access to the source code, then they can't really make meaningful changes to the software. So the person distributing the software without source code is still standing in the way, getting in the way of freedom, because they don't actually grant the users enough freedom. Now, it is technically possible to reverse engineer and all that sort of stuff, but it takes too much effort, and it's like that sort of a thing. It's not really compatible with the spirit of the freedom idea, because like if you give a software, then if you just say that, well, you can modify it, but if you don't give the source code, then it's like, yeah, well, I guess it's like technically possible, but it's not practical. It's not very practical. So that's that idea of the source code being a requirement. So really the only law that would be necessary to achieve software freedom is the law that requires that source code be distributed. And then of course getting rid of any copyright law kinds of things that would restrict the use of the software. Because by default the people have the rights to use the software however they want, unless the legal system denies those rights in the form of copyright. But to achieve proper software freedom, it also takes a law. It takes the law to require to distribute the source code along with the software. Because it is unpractical to modify the software, having to reverse engineer it first. It does obstruct the modifying of the software. So at the very least, it is in spirit a violation of the freedom to not give the people the source code. So that's that, but then is it freedom that is taken from the person when they distribute software? Well, no, because as I've now just described, what the person who creates a software does when they set the terms in the license or just don't distribute the source code with the software is that they are obstructing freedom. They get in the way. They are stopping the freedom that the people can exercise, the users of the software. So now if you don't subscribe to the idea that the people deserve the freedom and then just distributing the binary without the source code is enough, well, that's just a philosophical, ethical stance, but at least it should be obvious that when you are actually writing the terms for the users to follow in the form of the license, well, that is quite obviously you literally writing the rules for other people to follow. That's not you exercising freedom in your life. That's not you living your life the way you want and doing what you want and doing it with whatever people and however you want to do it and all that sort of stuff. That's not you exercising freedom in your life. You are literally writing rules that other people must follow when you are distributing software under a license. Now, that happens with any license, even with free libre licenses, but the thing with free libre licenses is that it grants the people the rights that the copyright law would otherwise deny. So technically the free libre license just cancels those copyright law restrictions. So in that sense, writing those rules in that case is actually a good thing, because the effect is actually positive since it cancels out the negative of the copyright law. But if you set any other terms that do not grant those freedoms that the copyright law would otherwise deny, then you are exercising control over those people. Yeah, so like it's really obvious when you look at it, because you're not doing anything that has anything to do with your life. You are not exercising freedom in your life. So it is not freedom to choose a license. Yes, you can make that choice, but that does not necessarily imply that it's freedom in your life. What you have is power over other people. So what you get is the legal mechanism for choosing how you want to control those people. So just because you have a choice to make, that doesn't mean that it's freedom. You just have the choice to choose how to control people. So is something taken from you with a copyleft license that requires you to use that license? Yes, but is it freedom? Is it something you are entitled to in your own life? No. What is taken from you when you no longer have the choice to use the license that you want is not freedom, it is an opportunity to exercise control over other people. So, in other words, it is power that is taken from you. Now, there is a lot of people out there who like power. They want to exercise control over other people. They like writing rules and setting terms for other people to use their software, because they feel that they are entitled to power over other people. Now, if they then proceed to call it freedom, because they see that it is freedom the way they can control other people, well, then we have a disagreement on what the term freedom means in the first place. The way I see what freedom means and the free software movement's argument is that each individual person in their own life and how they choose to interact with others is freedom. But controlling other people is not freedom, because you are now violating those other people. So given a definition for freedom being that individual person's freedom which does not include the violation of other people's freedoms, then with that definition, then I hope that you can see how the argument the free software movement makes, that it is not freedom that is taken from a person, it is control or power, whatever you want to call it. It's power over other people specifically, so control over other people, I mean. So power over other people, that's what's taken. If we have a disagreement on what the term freedom means, well then that's just semantics. But there's also something worth noting that is also important to this, that some people also seem to fail to understand, in that when I said that a person's interactions with other people, so long as like they are all in agreement, so consensual interactions are not considered violations of other people's freedom, so there is the ability to interact with other people. So long as everyone agrees to those interactions and transactions and the likes, then no one's freedom is being violated. Well, someone might make the argument that, well, agreeing to a proprietary license is a person agreeing to that transaction, so that person who agrees to the license, their freedom isn't being taken because they agreed to that transaction. So they agreed with consent, they wrote I agree or clicked on a button I agree to a software license thing. So then that would be a consensual interaction. However, there is an argument to be made against that, and what the argument the free software movement makes is that the mere existence of proprietary software in the first place is what's evil, because a person who creates a software, if they license it under a proprietary license, they have now put out there into the world a thing that requires that people surrender their freedoms to use that thing. Now, what position are you in to do that? What right is it of yours to put out there something that takes away the people's freedom in exchange for using that thing? The argument the free software movement makes is that what you are doing right there, the mere creation of proprietary software itself, is evil because you are setting the terms for the people. So basically the argument that, well, you don't have to use that software, it doesn't make that software not violate the people's freedom, because the fact that the software itself exists and it requires that people surrender their freedom, that's the problem. So it doesn't become a problem after a person has agreed to it. It was already a problem when it existed. So the idea there is that you do not have the right to ask for a person's freedom in exchange for using that software. That itself is the problem. It's not your right. Now, we have already gotten into the ethics, so that's what I'm discussing now. You don't have ethically, fundamentally, morally, the right to take away someone else's freedom. So you do not have the right to write the terms that require other people to surrender their freedoms. So it is a question of ethics. If you don't agree with the ethics, then oh well, but that's the moral stance that the free software movement makes. That you're not allowed to ask for someone's freedom in exchange for using that software. And also you need to remember the fact that the people who wish to retain their freedom, you have now denied them the opportunity to use that software. You also have to keep that in mind, because, well, even if you say that, well, they can keep their freedom by not using that proprietary software, well, do you notice how you have now denied them from using that software? A person who wants to have freedom now cannot use your software, because that software would deny their freedom. There's also something to keep in mind, that you're putting out there into the world a bunch of software, but it can't be used. On topics like these, one has to understand the difference between disagreements with ethics and values versus disagreements in the technicalities and the terminology that we use to discuss those things, because those two are different things. A disagreement on a moral and ethical basis just means that the two people in a discussion do not share their values. The people believe in different fundamental rights in terms of ethics. So there is a difference on what a person finds to be worth some value attachment. But when we are talking about the technicalities on what is specifically freedom and who is exercising control over who and all that sort of thing, all that sort of stuff, that is technicalities, and those technicalities can be discussed in objective means, and there is a correct idea and an incorrect idea there. Or rather, when I'm talking about an idea, that idea would be the argument that someone makes. If someone makes the argument that a person who writes rules for other people to follow is not exercising power over other people, then there is an obvious contradiction there, given the definition that power over other people is controlling those people. So if that person writes rules in a license that controls those people, well, there is an obvious contradiction in that person's statement that there is no power over other people being exercised. So there is a distinction, but a lot of the time people do not seem to recognize this distinction, disagreeing whether that person deserves that power, whether they are philosophically, morally, and ethically entitled to that power. That's a different disagreement from, is that person exercising control over that other person? One is something that can be objectively discussed, and there are factual and technical aspects to it that can be proven false or rather correct or incorrect in a statement that a person makes. Like I just gave the example. If we agree that for this discussion of ours that we are going to have now, if we agree that this word means this thing, then there are things that we can agree on and disagree on. But in the end, there is only one reality, so the objectively correct way to describe the things that are going on, that is the only way to describe the things that are going on. Like, in essence, there is only one correct interpretation of the events, but if there is a disagreement on a philosophical, moral grounds whether a person deserves the right to have control over another person, there's a different discussion, because in that discussion we are discussing whether they have the inherent right to do that, whether they are ethically entitled to control other people. Do people deserve freedom at all? Is slavery right or wrong? That's a different question, because there is no discussion on the technicalities, on what is slavery and who is controlling who and all that sort of stuff. Slavery, just as an example. So yeah, that is a distinction one has to be aware of and recognize. Both are relevant to this discussion. Both the ethics and the technicalities are relevant to the topic of discussion. But if you make the argument that someone is technically incorrect because you disagree with them ethically, then you are in the wrong. You are technically incorrect. Because if your argument relies on the assumption that you are right because you believe in the ethically correct idea, well, that doesn't make you technically correct. If your technical stance is incorrect, then it is incorrect. If you say that no power is being exercised over other people when a person writes rules for other people to follow, well, you're just objectively incorrect. There's only one way to look at that, and that's not something that is subjective. But then the argument that, well, I deserve the right inherently, philosophically, ethically, to control those people, well, then there is no incorrectness to it. That's just a question of is it right or wrong. So yeah, there is a distinction there. So the reason I emphasize that in the form of repetition is because a lot of people really don't seem to understand that distinction. They seem to conflate the two as if they are the same. So they equate them. They say that someone is inherently wrong. That means that they are wrong on every level. They are wrong in the technicalities and they are wrong in the ethics. So one has to understand that distinction there. So whether you agree with the values and ethics of the free software movement or not, it is still important that you understand the technicalities of what we discuss. That a person who creates a software, when they set terms for other people to follow in their use of that software, that person who made the software is now exercising control over those people. That is the objective way to describe that situation. The existence of that software that requires that people surrender their freedom to use it. If I say that's morally wrong, that's me saying that there is an inherent ethical right that I believe in, that people deserve, that is being violated. So, yeah, it's important to be aware of what is it that we discuss. Do you agree with the values of the free software movement? If a person does not, that still doesn't mean that they get to make the argument that the free software movement is technically wrong. That, oh no, they are not controlling the people when they write the licenses. No, they are. If you literally write rules that other people must follow, then yes, you are exercising control over those people. That's just objectively the correct way to represent that situation. You are writing rules that other people must follow. Now, of course, we can disagree with the semantics and the terminology on what it means to exercise control over other people, but so long as a given definition is agreed on, then there is only one correct way to describe the situation. But then whether you believe it is ethically right or wrong, for that person for that person to exercise the control. Well, that's just a question of ethics. After all, the reality doesn't bend to your will. So the reality, for what it exists, it's not subjective. There is only one objective, correct reality. So however you choose to describe that reality, that's just us describing the reality, but the reality is what the reality is. So the distinctions on how we describe that reality versus how do we believe that the reality should be, they are different. How we want that reality to be, that's the question of the ethics. I want there to be these rights that people have and such. And then there's the descriptions of the reality where we look at how the things are in the real world and we talk about those things. The way they are is the way they are. There is only one correct reality. Yeah. It is also, of course, possible that people, in an attempt to make the ones who support the free software movement look like hypocrites, may describe the free software movement supporters as being hypocrites because they say they want freedom, but then they take away the ability to choose some license that the people who oppose the free software movement say is freedom to use that license. But of course, you have to understand that we are not talking about the disagreement on the semantics, on what it is that the freedom means. Is it freedom for you to control other people and set terms for them to follow? Is that freedom? Well, that's a technical thing. That's us disagreeing on some technicalities on specifically semantics, and we don't agree with the terminology. What is that freedom means, the term? But it's just a word. You have to understand that the reality that we exist in, if those people behave in certain ways and their behavior influences other people in certain ways, the objective reality in how those things happen, how those events play out, that is the objective reality. Now, if we disagree with the terminology we use to describe that reality, well, that's up to the disagreement on the terminology. That's the terminology. That's us having a disagreement on the terminology. But the reality is what the reality is. So, if we can agree that, well, we could even come up with an imaginary word, or it doesn't have to be imaginary. We can come up with a new word, just for that discussion. And if we have the word X, that I'm just using the letter X. So the letter X, if that stands for what I say freedom is, so my definition for what freedom is, I apply that definition to the letter X. And now we have a discussion on what the letter X is in the world. How does the letter X manifest in the world? Who does deserve that right, and who is controlling who, and all that sort of thing. Then as long as we can agree on that letter X to mean what it means, we are not talking about the word freedom. We are not talking about the word freedom. We are talking about the letter X now. So the letter X now has the definition on what I would say freedom means, but it doesn't necessarily have to be what you agree with freedom is. And because we are not calling it freedom, then there is no conflict, because it's just the letter X. So we can resolve those sorts of disputes like that. We can just agree that for this discussion, we agree that the letter X stands for this. It doesn't mean that you agree that freedom means that. Your definition of freedom may be different than mine, but we agree that for this discussion, the letter X stands for this thing. So that's just a disagreement with the semantics and those sorts of things. Because the objective reality still remains the same. We've just chosen different words to describe it. So is it freedom to control other people with the power of the license? Well, that depends on your definition of freedom. Yeah. But then, when we make the philosophical assessment, and we talk about who deserves what, and who deserves to control other people and who doesn't, and all that sort of stuff, then that is subjective to the extent that ethics are. Now, I would like to believe that there is only one correct ethical position, but of course that sort of thing cannot be proven correct or incorrect with technical discussions. So yeah, that's kind of a difficult question to answer, and I don't have the answer for that. But of course, naturally I would believe that I'm the one in the right. So yeah, that's kind of arbitrary, and I recognize that, but still, it is how it is. It is what it is, what am I supposed to do about it? So yeah, anyway, if we agree that the technicalities are what the technicalities are, then do people deserve certain treatment? That's a question of the ethics. Do not mix them up. Do not make the mistake of getting those two mixed up. There is only one reality, but there's lots of ways to describe it. And then the question of ethics is, from the technical point of view, subjective. Right. So, I think that's that for this speech. Until next time, bye.